Are we recording? Okay, excellent. Cool. So we're in chapter 18 of Father Norris Clarke's book, One of the Many, and it's called The Transcendental Nature of Being. So I'm Fraser, for those who are new and haven't met me. I live in Columbus, Ohio. I really enjoy theology and philosophy, though Brian and Sam would probably be judging a lot of what I say today for my lack of knowledge as I fumble my way through here. But here we are. The transcendental nature of being. So first of all, what is the transcendental? So Clarke provides us that it comes from the Latin word transcendere. I know I said that wrong, but bear with me there. It means that it is leaping over, something that is not merely applied to being. So it's something that's beyond ourself, and that's what transcendence means. And so in this chapter, he beckons to the three transcendental properties of being that is talked about in this book so far: goodness, truth, and beauty. So for those of us who are new or maybe not remember, Clarke actually talks about all these things in previous chapters, and so he merely recognizes that in this chapter here. And then first off, he begins by saying there's a difference between the Thomist understanding of these three transcendentals and the liberal sort of Kantian notion of the transcendentals, and what are the differences. So according to Clarke, both the Platonic and the liberal tradition view as these things being imposed onto reality, so to speak, or being, and not very intrinsic to them. And I'm not sure if he's being entirely fair to the Platonist, though I think he's fair to the liberal tradition that kind of sees every meaning that is imposed onto reality as being not inherent to reality itself or being itself. Furthermore, he says in the Platonic and the Neoplatonic traditions, unity and goodness is attributed to every being that participates in the supreme good, or the one. So, which in the Christian tradition would be God. And the good or the one is beyond being in the Platonic tradition. So in a lot of different ways, the only way you could know the good or the one is not even through rationality, but through mystical experiences. He also notes that within the Thomist tradition, there has been an ongoing debate of whether beauty to be included within the transcendentals, or what is considered transcendental to being. And so we'll get into some of that argument towards the end of the chapter. Clarke also makes the observation that being is also active, it's not static, and he wants to avoid thinking of being as just static, because he's already established that what defines a being is unity. And so he thinks that he wants us to avoid us thinking that because something is united or unity is what defines being, we shouldn't think of being as static, but either being as active. So what does it mean for being to be active? In simple terms, it means that beings are affected and affect other beings. So for example, me being here affects the dog, and the dog being in my room affects me. Right. So a line that I really liked that Clark mentions here is that he says to be is to be actively present to other real beings, or be present to other real beings. Okay. Having said that about being active, he then goes on to talk a little bit about truth and what truth is. And his definition of truth is the conformity of the mind to the being. We're able to comprehend reality because of the inherentness of the logic that is in every being that we encounter. That's what makes truth to be discovered, possible to be discovered, possible to investigate. So he delves a little bit into the epistemology of things. He also contrasts this from Kant's understanding, where the real being is the basis of our knowledge. Okay, so there's a lot of typo here. I think this was not well thought out. But I think for Kant, there's not an inherent coherence to reality, as opposed to how a Thomist would understand reality. Beings can never be known exhaustively, but they can be known through and through. They cannot be exhaustively known because they're from an infinite mind, first of all, and our minds are limited. And he also quotes Einstein, which is a beautiful quote, where it says, "Whatever is real is mysterious, and whatever is not mysterious has nothing to do with reality." So reality, in a sense, is like deep down, reality is something that is extremely mysterious. We can't ever comprehensively or exhaustively know reality. And then he talks about goodness and what is ontological goodness. And so he says that ontological goodness is something that is desirable in and of itself. And that's how he defines it. And so he makes a few theological points where anything that is good is to be desired, is potentially going closer to God because of its participation in God. And he also makes the point that we as human beings have the potentiality to be further and further defined. And so that's what he says about ontological goodness. And then what he says about ontological beauty is that the way that he defines beauty here is that which gives delight when contemplated upon. And that is his definition of beauty. And one of the reasons why, we'll get into that, but beauty often comes through cognitive senses. So he's recognizing 2 points here. One is that beauty is can extremely be abstract and theoretical, but at the same time, because we are creatures that rely on cognitive things, a lot of times we realize beauty in those terms. For example, listening to a great piece of music, or watching a beautiful painting, and so on and so forth. So beauty brings both intellect and will, and that is one of the reasons why he thinks that beauty has to be part of the transcendentals, and not just a subspecies of goodness. Because one of the things he says earlier in this chapter is that the people who say that beauty should not be included in the list of transcendentals say that because they argue that it is an aspect of goodness, and therefore you don't need a separate category or a category to describe it. And Clark seems to disagree with those people who think that they should not, like, beauty should not be included in it. And so so he asked the question of what constitutes as beauty, and he says people used to think of beauty in terms of proportions, but theologically there are different problems to it, because we cannot think of God in terms of proportions, or that he has parts, because God is simple, and he cannot be divided. So because God is unity and God is simple, the idea of defining beauty as proportion cannot be applied to God, and for it doesn't work as a good definition for beauty, or what constitutes as beauty. And so the three things that he picks up on are integrity, harmony, and splendor. And out of the three, he thinks that splendor can be more directly applied to God, even though other things can also be applied to God. So, for example, when he talks about harmony, he talks about the doctrine of Trinity and how all the three persons of the Godhead work together in accomplishing their will. He talks about the glory of God, which he says is the Bible's way of putting God's splendor or radiance, and a more mystical way of talking about splendor or radiance would be talking about the uncreated light, and that we could never fully see God's uncreated light because we depend on that light. Well, kind of the C.S. Lewis's situation where it's very hard to look at the sun itself, but without the sun, we cannot look at anything else. So he has similar language talking about the radiance of God, that the beings that participate in God rely on his light. So he ends the chapter by saying this, that he harkens back to whatever he said about cognitive senses and how we depend on cognitive senses to recognize beauty. And he says that this is not going to be something that going to limit us from knowing God and enjoying his beauty forever in the afterlife, because we're not limited by our cognitive senses, but all of our being would be able to recognize God's beauty. So with that, that is my summary of chapter 18. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much. Yeah, I think that was a very good, concise summary of the chapter. So before we kind of launch into the discussion, I'll just open it out. You know, if anybody has any questions or comments, observations that are directly related to the presentation, please feel free to bring those out now.
I might have something.
Great.
Okay. Yeah, let me just start to share my video so you can see me. All right, hold on. There I am. Okay. All right, so that last bit where you were talking about beauty as a transcendental, and how Clark goes over the debate over whether it belongs in the list and all that. I have a perspective that I think will be of value here, because I'm probably the person in this chat who ever tested with Clark. And so I was there during one of the lectures where he was actually talking about that, and that was like the year before, the semester before he came out with the book. So I got to see the notes for the book, before, you know, the sort of not fully edited, you know, copies. And there was one story that I think that you will all like. He was talking about beauty, and he was talking about beauty as a transcendental, and he was talking about one of his colleagues who was disputing whether it belonged on the list of transcendentals, and said that beauty, wasn't because beauty wasn't a universal property. Not everything and not everyone is beautiful, right? And Father Clark said, I think that you're just not seeing the beauty in things. You need to look harder. And he said, well, what about an ugly person, like a really old, crone, ugly woman? And Father Clark said, no, her too. Everyone and everything. It's all beautiful in its own way. And so he's like, so the guy was like, oh, I just can't fathom that. And they're talking, and they go on an elevator, and there in the elevator is this Hispanic maid, and she's somewhat hard featured, but she has a baby with her, and she's smiling at the baby and talking to the baby and making cooing sounds to the baby, and the smile completely transforms her face. And so Father Clark says that he sort of elbowed the other guy, and the guy like nodded. He was like, I get it. End of story.
That's a beautiful story. He does make the remark that if we're not able to see the beauty in every being, then it's not that the being itself is not beautiful, it's that we're not able to see it, right? He does make that quick remark in the book. Yeah. But thanks for the story. It's a good one.
You're welcome.
It also, because Hart was in a he had an interview with David Armstrong last week, I think, and he talked about Japanese art and the idea of wabi-sabi, and how the Japanese are able to see beauty in the imperfect things, in the aging things, so on and so forth. So what your story kind of corresponds to that. Yeah.
Cool.
No, absolutely. This is sort of an impressionistic, but you may have heard the Platonic dictum that beauty is the splendor of the true, right? And so it seems it's a more we have a conception of beauty perhaps, but there's a way that the very showing forth of being as such, right? Beauty is that theophanic dimension of absolutely anything, right? So it's sort of, we may have our subjective but so much of it is in the way that we look, right? And the degree to which we are open to it. I mean, it reminds me very much of sort of, often contemplative writers will say, just like, say you go to mass, right? And you're not always going to see the beauty of it. It may just seem very mundane to you, but
Sure.
we may have some obstacle within ourselves that kind of, thanks for joining us, Todd. I'm glad that you were able to join us for just a little bit, but you're quite welcome if you ever want to check out the next session. Is our last session on this book, and then we'll delve into Father Shivara's Analogia Entis, which is going to be a bit of a mountain climb, but I think it'll be bracing and hopefully very, very edifying. So glad you could stop in. But yeah, it's like we have that. It's sort of like the log in our eye, as it were, or kind of the something in the eye of the heart that sort of prevents theoria, that vision of the true. It's sort of like, again, I apologize for waxing lyrical about it, but it's sort of like St. John of the Cross, when he speaks in a poem of his about how, love has so worked me over that the good and the bad in me are of the self same savor, right? And if you see with that eye, then even the darkness, even the most wrenching, sorrowful things, right? Even in there, we can find that beauty. And I think that's really, one of the greatest gifts we've been given. But
I have a ton of questions, actually.
of
So
course, yeah.
anyone can answer these ones. My first question is, why is love not considered part of the transcendental ones? That is question number one. Question number two, when he talks about the conformity of between the mind and being as the definition of truth, how is that different from the correspondence theory of truth? I'm asking because I don't really understand the correspondence theory of truth. My third question is he right in conflating sort of the Kantian tradition and the Platonic tradition in saying that the transcendental is something that's extrinsic to being? So those would be my three questions, and you can answer them in the order that you please.
Anyone have any ideas?
I'm sorry, I was a bit distracted. Just that somebody was kind of asking me about. We're going to get a few more people hop into the discussion in just a little bit, but Fraser, could you
Yeah,
say
do you want me
that
to
again,
repeat
please?
yeah. So my first question was, why is love not one of the transcendentals? Question number two is, whenever he talks about, when he gives the definition for truth, and says the conformity between mind and being, how is that different from the correspondence theory of truth? And I'm asking because I'm not very I don't know much about correspondence truth theory. The second is he fair when he sort of conflates the Kantian tradition and the Platonic tradition as seeing the transcendentals as something that's apart or extrinsic to being? Those are my questions.
Right, and I think definitely the that last question is definitely one that I would expect Mr. Watkinson will have something to say when he's in a actually he's at a memorial service for a friend of his, and but in any case, which will conclude soon. It's a Zoom thing, but there have been very strong challenges to the notion of, in a sense, like the Platonic forms as being only in kind of a separate realm, right? That is kind of cut off from manifestation. I think there's a different way of reading it that would. So I think that may have been a very common way of characterizing the Platonic tradition, but I think there are many readings of it that see it much more as much more synoptic with the Thomistic reading in that regard.
Yeah, so my understanding of the Kantian tradition and the Platonic tradition is not well versed to but from my understanding, it would seem like Kant is operating from a very skeptical notion, right? The meaning is something that we impose onto reality, and there's nothing like, you can't say that, you know, a dog loves you, right? Because like we're imposing that sort of idea of love onto the dog. We're not really sure if dog is able to sense any of those things, you know. So all of reality is a sort of imposition of our models. But to my understanding, Platonic tradition would be sort of, once you have the forms, you're able to recognize those forms in the world. So those seem to be very two different ways of thinking, and so that's why I'm like a little thrown back as to how, like, you know, Clark is characterizing those two schools of thought and then putting them together. So if my understanding of both those things are wrong, please correct me. But
Well, so here I would say, I mean, in a general way, right? Like my understanding is that Kant was very skeptical about the possibility of, you know, precisely what is affirmed in the Platonic and Thomistic epistemology or gnoseology, which is that, you know, and actually you find this in Aristotle as well, right? In the knowing of a thing, right, there's a real conjunction between the knower and the known, right? Right. It's not merely a representation, right? This is sort of a realist epistemology, right? You know, I want to parcel out. I want to get a little deeper at some point into how this relates to, for example, the classical theory of vision, which was that sort of, you know, when you see a thing, right? It's you know, the classical way of thinking was that there's a beam of light that comes out from your eyes and melds with that which is seen. It's not merely a passive reception, but there's and I think that even if you, obviously there are ways to harmonize a realist epistemology with modern theories of vision, right? I'm sure that work has been done, but it kind of helps me in a sense to think of, you know, the vision of a thing, vision, knowing, right? There's that intimate connection between, right? But there's a real contact. It's almost like a tactile. There's sort of a right. You're not cut off in your own subjective representations, right? I think for Kant, you know, I hope I'm not caricaturing him, but you really do only know your representations that are, because your mind has these sort of ways, you know. So he doesn't affirm the ideas as kind of subsisting in a transcendent realm to which we can accede, or to which they can kind of be, you know, revealed to us. In that sense, we don't have access to what he would call the noumenon, right? But in the structure of our mind, we have certain
phenomena as all right.
Right, but there is something like the forms, right, in that there are certain categories of knowledge, or certain, you know, I guess like quantity or spatiality, or, you know, different, right, fundamental constituents of the way that we, as rational beings, know things. But those are all just on our side, right? They're sort of in our structures of knowledge. They don't actually reflect faithfully the way it really is.
Yeah.
And, you know, again, I mean, there may be a way to harmonize those views, right? I mean, there's sort of the you may be familiar with the Transcendental Thomists, right, have done the most work, and people like influenced by that approach, like Bernard Lonergan, right, I'm sure has kind of worked out kind of connecting sort of the Kantian conception of the transcendentals to a Thomistic epistemology. But I think the claim would just, I mean, maybe just that Kant is unduly skeptical in that way. He circumscribes that which the intellect can know a bit too tightly, because he is, I guess, so skeptical of kind of the ontotheological systems, right? That what he would see as that, right? Which kind of, in his view, characterized metaphysics to his day. You know, I don't claim to be an expert on Kant. Certainly, that's an area that I would like to delve into more. You know, I mean, so it seems like when you say the correspondence theory of truth, right? And that's a modern analytic term, right? I mean, basically, right, you know, the truth or falsity of a statement is determined only by how it relates to the world and whether it accurately describes that world. I don't think it would posit anything like the forms. However, you know, I mean, that there is a way, though, that you know, a realist epistemology, you know, a Platonic or Thomistic epistemology would say that our ideas of things do correspond to the real things. So it is, I guess, it correspondence as opposed to, there was another theory which I think has faded somewhat. If I recall, it's called the Coherence theory of truth, and this was very popular with absolute idealists, including in the much neglected British post-Hegelian school of idealism, right? Which and that's a little bit above my pay grade, really, to explain the coherence theory of truth. But that's, you know, so then it's like, for an idealist of that stripe, it's not that for something to be true doesn't mean that we have access in that way to the things in themselves, right? Right, or to a ground of being in itself, or to kind of these forms that really underlie the whole fabric of reality. But it means we say something is true, right? There's a certain wholeness, there's a certain validity to our concepts about things, right? But again, it basically tries to formulate a way that things hang together within thought, within mind, without reference to objective reality as a you know, as kind of a standard for the truth of things. That's a whole other thing that I'd love to get into sometime, but again, it's an area that I'm very much but they have a whole idealist logic is in some ways connected to classical logic, but it departs in crucial ways. I mean, for the coherence theory of truth, right, you know, you want to get into some of those idealists like you know, Fichte, Schlegel, Hegel, and the British idealists kind of took it further, drawing on some sort of developments in logic in the late 1800s. I'm just blanking on the gentleman's name, but yeah. So correspondence is an alternative. Correspondence theories and coherence theories is kind of like the divide there in modern philosophy.
And why is love not part of the transcendentals?
Well, okay, if you have any ideas. Oh, okay. Or I guess Brian's letting me talk. All right. I don't want to, like, you know, roll over him or anything like that, steamroll over him. I have my impression is that when the transcendentals are being cataloged, there's not a desire to multiply them, you know, beyond necessity. Take for example, if the true is a transcendental, is it a known truth? And if so, then shouldn't knowledge be a transcendental? But then if everything, in a sense, knows something, are we positing some sort of panpsychism? I mean, it gets complicated, right? So yes, I mean, if goodness and beauty are transcendentals, then that sort of corresponds to love the way truth corresponds to knowledge, but you wouldn't necessarily want to add that onto the list. I mean, if one thing implies another, right, then I think there was a desire to keep the list short. But I could be wrong about that, but that was my impression. Now to the second point about correspondence theory, I've always taken the correspondence theory to be, that's just a contemporary term that refers to the old Aristotelian dictum that to say the truth is to say what is that it is and what is not that it is not, rather than the other way around. And that is really, I think, what Clark was referring to when he spoke about the
Body and
human being.
yeah. Okay.
I think it's the same thing.
It's the same thing. Okay.
That's what I think. So that.
Hi, Eden. We were just talking about different theories of truth, like the correspondence theory of truth, the coherence theory of truth, and sort of the way it relates to the transcendentals. And also another thread there was, Fraser was wondering whether Clark is quite fair to say Kant or for that matter, the Platonists and Neoplatonists in terms of, characterizing their epistemology. And I think sometimes he exaggerates a little bit in order to kind of, as a teaching tool, right? To kind of, you always caricature a little bit. There's obviously more complexity, and if you were to go into like different philosophers, right, there might be some whose approach doesn't fall into that. I mean, for example, I would be very surprised if I mean, you look at, say, Dionysius the Areopagite or Proclus for that. I wouldn't be surprised if actually, I mean, there's a great closeness and sort of anticipation of St. Thomas's view of things in those authors. So I think I'm much more inclined to read them together rather than, but nevertheless, I think that juxtaposition, even if it's kind of allied to, certain scholarly views, right? It can be a useful teaching tool. And I mean, part of what it, because, so, I mean, Clark is an existential Thomist, right? And their view, but based on sort of Etienne Gilson's history of philosophy, right? It's kind of like they really emphasize the uniqueness and kind of originality in a way of Thomas, right? And in a sense, and I have a, sort of like, it reminds me of Heidegger in a way, right? Because it's sort of like this, everybody overlooked the truth of being, of existence, right? All this time, and now we're going to show you, right, that either Heidegger himself, right, which is this even more hubristic, but kind of like, and then Thomas got it, and I think we can question that, but it still, it doesn't mean that the view that he critiques and kind of presents as an alternative to the Thomistic view, I'm sure does exist, has been maintained by certain thinkers, but whether it's fair or not is something that we should be willing to reevaluate, right, on the basis of different the way the field has developed since the kind of the days of Gilson and Maritain.
Yeah, I've noticed that as somewhat of a theme throughout the whole book, is that his this doesn't really have, I guess, much bearing specifically on this like chapter, but I feel like as we're nearing the end, this is somewhat of an important reflection, I guess, on what he's had to say to this point. Is that I think he has kind of had the greatest, like, I guess, struggles insofar as like this book has had like issues is in this kind of characterizations of alternative views throughout the history of philosophy. Like I think of the characterization of Molinism that he gives as an understanding. And I wasn't here for this meeting, so I wasn't sure if it was discussed or not. But there's a similar thing where he talks about how Molinism, is Platonic, and so it assumes that all of these different visions of or different histories or whatever you want to call it, different like choices that people could make all exist independently. And so God is seeing sort of all of them simultaneously. And it feels like, yeah, there is a certain amount of caricatural, as you say, probably as a teaching tool to try to show where the lines are drawn most clearly. But I also wonder, he kind of fails to make that apparent if that is what he's doing, if he's just trying to say, oh, this is sort of a caricatured Kant, so we can see where the differences between Kant and St. Thomas lie. And I do wonder sometimes if he's not somewhat overcommitted to the kind of existential Thomist picture, and as a result, not as willing as he ought to be, perhaps, to present the other positions, perhaps where they've, where they perhaps agree, even more with Thomas than he might suggest them to. And I do wonder about that, because he seems to have a handful of pet positions that he is quite a fan of and will present very clearly, like the process theologians. But sometimes I do feel like Kant and Descartes as well, because they're the same people that Gilson was opposed to, don't necessarily get the fairest shake throughout this book in general. It's still very excellent, I think, but it just has sometimes some issues with its characterization of the history of philosophy.
So, since Eden brought up a process theology, it reminded me of one more question that I had, which is, whenever he says that being is active and that it is every being is being, affected and affects other things. However, when we talk about God, it's always just one way, right? It's only God self-revealing and affecting creation and never being affected by creation. So isn't that a sort of a contradiction to suggest that being is active at the same time not applying that to God? Or would that be a categorical mistake because God is not a being, but being itself?
Right. I mean, and this is where, by the way, even though this chapter was specifically on the transcendentals, feel free to open it out to any other topics, right, that were raised in previous sessions or in the book. But, of course, right, Clark is very committed to divine simplicity, right? Right. So God must be, beyond change, right? Beyond, right. There's no potentiality in God to be actualized, right? If there were a potentiality that could be actualized, right, he would not be the actus purus, right? He would not be, right?
Yeah. Well, I understand that, but it seems like he's being inconsistent so that he could, maintain his simplicity. But the question is, like, isn't he being inconsistent here so that he could maintain simplicity?
Well, I mean, to be active is certainly to affect.
Right. Sure.
But and I remember when we were talking about this in class, this was a very long time ago. This sort of thing came up. The question of like how universally does this definition of being as active really apply? But on the divine level, when God is being affected by creation, he's not. He's really just affecting himself, and what he by creating, he's sort of producing potentiality within being that otherwise wouldn't exist. But but creatures don't exist on the same level because we don't exist in parity with God, right? We
Right.
can be receptive of his activity, but it's not. There's no parallelism. There's no parity to make that kind of relationship. It on the surface certainly looks like an inconsistency, but I think it's a necessary one when you have when we're talking about the kind of being God is. And divine simplicity is difficult. It produces paradoxes. So, and this seems to qualify as one. And I doubt there's a remedy for all the paradoxes. It's just probably above all our pay grades. That doesn't, to even think about it. The fact that we can even grasp it, if it's even so, insofar as it's true, if it is, the fact that we can even grasp it at all is, we're blessed, we're lucky. But probably that's the best we can do, and so we're gonna run into problems. And this could be one of them. It doesn't even seem like the worst of them. I mean, I like to bang my head up against the energy essence distinction and compare that to absolute divine simplicity and see how those two work together. This might be a paradox. It might be a genuine paradox. It's just, something then we'd have to deal with.
I was actually wondering, sorry, if you could just sort of restate what it is like that you find paradoxical about it. I heard the first part. I just like to hear it again because I think I might have a potential answer. I just would like to hear it again, sort of, just so I could conceptualize a little bit better what you're driving at here.
Oh, well, my understanding was that God, unlike creatures, affects but is not affected. Right, other creatures, they're active in the sense of being both causative of change in other things, and also being changed and caused, in parallel. Whereas God, we don't really, theologically, we can't really literally affirm that we affect God.
Sorry, I made a mistake. I didn't say the name. I was trying to ask Fraser. Sorry.
Oh,
what the paradox that he was potentially seeing was, just because I had forgotten the exact details. Sorry about that, but that is still helpful.
My question was, he says that active is or being is active and not just static, right? And so everything is affected by other beings, and they affect other beings. Now, why does that not apply to God? Is the question.
Okay, I think that the answer to that, right, is like, if being is active, right, and like you said, and so if one being sort of its existence relies on it acting in relationship to other things and so on. There's a really great paper by Clark on this, in part, called like being as active, probably being as being in relation or something like that. I can't remember the exact title, but it's in the essay collection that Hart recommends alongside this book, Being, Person, Act. And I think that's so that's like you said, to be a being is to be something in relation. Whereas, and I think you mentioned before, I think it's a somewhat of a category mistake. Whereas, because God's not a being, God is being itself.
Right.
So while all creatures have their existence insofar as they're active in relationship to one another, God is being itself, and so in a sense, God is activity itself. So as actus purus, God is acting on all beings in the sense of being their creator and sustainer, but God isn't being acted upon by those creations. It's sort of like a Neoplatonic thing, right? Like the effect can't be greater than the cause. So insofar as God is the greatest thing that there is, everything that he produces cannot act back on him, because that would be the effect acting on its cause, which is a logical impossibility.
Wait, can you repeat the last part again? Before whatever you said before, that would be a logical impossibility. Can you repeat that?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. The idea is like in Neoplatonism, which is the sort of the model that I take
Right.
for understanding this particular relation. There's this principle that the effect always has to be greater than, or sorry, the cause always has to be greater than the effect. Pardon me. And I think Clark talks about that in this book, but I don't remember off the top of my head where. And essentially, the idea is that if God is the greatest thing that there is, then his creation would be, it would be obviously one of his effects. The things that he's sustaining is one of his effects. And so you can't have the creation then affecting the cause, because that would be, that would require, in that sense, for the, for creation to be greater than, God, to have that ability to have a sort of backwards effect in that sense, which is, a logical impossibility. But I don't think you need that second part really as the answer to the question. The main part is the idea that God is being itself, God is activity, itself, and so God is acting on creatures but not being acted on, being reciprocally acted on by them. So yeah, sorry, the second part was kind of an unnecessary complication.
No,
I think the first part is the most important bit.
But
What's the
I think
question? Is the question, how can God be relational if he is like divinely simple? Is that the question? Like, how can he be personal and intimate? Or is that like not germane at all?
the question was in this chapter. He says that being is active, and so which he defines as, beings act on each other and are affected by each other. And so the question is God subject to being affected in his dealings with creation or other beings?
And the only way that God could be like personal, relational is if like that could happen, right? Is that what your question is implying?
That is the implication, because all of this, because the problem with the divine simplicity and impassibility, all those things, and Brian had this discussion where he talked about communion and how like God is being offended because people who are partaking of communion are not really worthy of it, or they don't, how does that, how do you use, no, that's a different question for Brian, but like in light of Christian revelation, how do you hold that tension, right? Because
Yeah,
all
who's
those
someone who's
other implications.
someone who is the being who is impassible. There's a great book that I kind of wrestled with this too, and I was recommended Thomas Way Andy's book, Does God Suffer? And he goes like in 3 chapters on why Actus Purus is ultimately the solution to the idea of how can it seem like God have these intentions and relational qualities per se, but also is unmoved and nothing moves him. There's a chapter in there, I think it's like chapter 4, chapter 5 of his book about how if God is fully actual, every potency that could, so anything that is a fundamental quality of God is completely like fully actual in its perfect extent, where God has no choice but to be personal. So in other words, what Thomas Way Andy says is that if God was not personal, there would be no existence, because if God is divinely simple and he is his act, then his act is also the same thing as him being intimately relational to the fullest extent of being actual. So I know that's like a whole lot of like hocus pocus stuff sometimes, but I that book like really kind of helped me understand how that makes sense. Like, how can God be completely impassible, but yet you read the Bible and you get all this emotion from God, right? How does that all tie into one another? I don't know if that helps your question, man. I'm sorry if that was on a tangent,
No,
but
that's
anyway,
okay.
that was a few thoughts.
It is helpful, but what is the name of the book you said? Does God Suffer?
Yeah, Does God Suffer by Thomas Way Andy. Where is he? He's a let me see. Yeah, he's this Catholic philosopher at is it Oxford? I'm trying to remember. Anyway, yeah, my professor recommended it, and I read it a bit ago, and it just like totally changed. It convinced me of divine simplicity and why divine simplicity is essential, because if God is his act and God is personal, the act which he is to be actualizing the world in existence is by definition a personal act in the fullness of what it means, to the fullest extent of what it means to be personal. But you can't have that, Thomas Wayne says, if you don't have divine simplicity, because to be intimately related to something is not the same thing as God's act. They're two different things. But in divine simplicity, he says they're the exact same thing, and so there's no problem there. Anyway, I would love to get any pushback though, because I don't know what you guys thought of, if you came across that or not.
I was wondering if you might be able to, I guess, expand a little bit when you say that, like, it for God's God's act to be sort of inherently personal. I've not read this book, so I don't really know the kind of whole way that this argument is built out. I've not read it, but I don't fully understand how that is that you could be both, like, if you want to talk about God has to be sort of inherently personal based on his based on the nature of revelation. The thing that kind of confuses me about that is that seems to, at least from the perspective of the question that Fraser is asking, just move the question back a step, and then you end up with, well, okay, if that has to be the case in divine simplicity, which I agree with you, I think that it does, then how does that work? You just kind of end up moving the question to sort of the mechanics of how something can be simple and relational at the same time. And I was just wondering if it comes back to the same kind of answer that I had given earlier about God being active in the sense of affecting all things, but not then being conversely affected, or if Wyandes provides a different sort of answer to that problem, because I'm not I'm not completely sure how that works at the moment.
Yeah, let me yeah, maybe this will help. And if this is not adequate, yeah, please let me know. I'm trying to pull out my notes on it, but it's something that I found it persuasive, but yeah, what do I know? Let me see. Yeah, so if so ultimately, so here, where is it? Let me find it real quick. Yeah, so what way Andy makes the case is that there's naturally good things in the world that we know to exist, like like, for example, we believe that like intellect is like a naturally good thing in the world: love, order, beauty, life, righteousness, what have you. And if what Andy says is that if actus purus is the case, then God must be the fullest actual extent of all these things. Divine, it's simply divine. So what Andy says is that if intellect and love and order and beauty are fundamental things that are present in the world, they cannot be actualized without something that is already actualized beauty, or what is already actualized order, love, what have you. And so for Wyandy, these things ultimately are reduced to one simple thing, which is God itself. And so if God is his act, which is, if it's simple, must include those things. Because if it did not include those things, then we would have something else than divine simplicity. But does that help? Tell me where I went wrong. So I'll sum it up like this. So therefore, this actual actualizer is itself purely actualized in one single act: love, intellect, order, righteousness, unity, life. Each of these attributes are wholly, and many others are wholly realized with no amount of potentiality at all. So nothing could ever be added to this. You guys know the argument, because he himself possesses all the limits of what love, order, intellect can ever be. And so therefore God's act is by definition personal, intrinsically personal, and if you have divine simplicity, like you can't, if you don't have divine simplicity, then God doesn't, if you're a personalist, what have you, then like being personal and relational is something that can be a part of God, but it's not really God itself. But if we can prove that God is relational and God is actus purus, then his actuality is itself a relational act, which must be the greatest act of all, by the way. So what he says is that if it's not relational at all, then you don't even have existence. Like nothing can exist at all. He would say the whole thing falls. So anyway, you're gonna get me ranting, but I just I don't know what you guys think of that. I thought it was pretty interesting, but anyway.
Okay, I can see that. I'll obviously leave it to Fraser to see if that clarifies his question, but definitely
Well, that is
definitely answers mine.
Yeah, that is an option that I've heard from people, is like, God eternally suffers, and therefore this act of his act of existence, if you will, itself is is suffering with the creation or the universe. Is that similar to what you're saying, Thomas?
Yeah, I'm saying
But
yeah.
You're saying in terms of
Go ahead, I'm sorry.
relationality, right? Because God is infinitely relational, and his act or whatever proceeds from him is a relational, right? So it's eternally built in to God, if you will, correct?
Yeah, and it's not just relational, but it must also it must be at the exact same instant, both life, beauty, order, love, righteousness,
everything,
unity,
right.
all that, all the caboodle, right? So and so I thought that was interesting. I don't know what you thought, but I thought that was interesting, because then that would I found it to ultimately mean that we would have an argument for why God's relationship is literally beyond comprehension, but also that this relational act is literally the necessary cause of anything to exist. So it just seems to because Isaiah, what does Isaiah say, or what does Romans say? Your thoughts are higher than our thoughts, all that crazy stuff. It seems to like fit together with that as well, without being contradictory. It seems like that. But anyway,
I think the question that I'm raising is a little bit different, in that is in any way, in any meaningful way, is God affected by the relationality that he establishes with this creation?
I think I can speak to that. All right, so I mean, we are still talking about Clark, so I just wanted to show you this. All right, so in his Aquinas lecture,
Eden has it too.
in his Aquinas lecture at Marquette, one of the things that Clark talked about, which was pretty new and revolutionary, was the proposal that receptivity belongs as one of the properties of being, and that belonged to God too. That he said that this goes against Aristotle, who would not give receptivity to pure act, but he said that we have to, because receptivity was some sort of imperfection or privation. It was a degradation to receive rather than just to give. And he says that in the divine, however, because we have the benefit of divine revelation, we know about the Trinity, and in the Trinity there is a principle of receptivity.
Sure.
There's the begetting, and there's the begetter and the one begotten.
Yeah. Whenever Thomas has said the eternality of relation, right? That's what I immediately went to, is Trinity, because God is like relational, because he's triune, right? And so the act of existence itself is like relational, sure.
Yes, the receptivity isn't just in, say, the Son or the Logos,
right?
Because the Logos gives back what he receives to the Father, what he receives from the Father. Now the Logos but creation is within the logos. So so creation in the logos is in a sort of analogous way affecting the Father, but not directly. The logos is the point of contact between God and creation, where God can be affected by creation.
Okay. Yeah, I think we're getting somewhere here. So, okay. So in the second person of the Trinity, God the Father is affected because of his creation. Is that right?
I think I'm positing that he's affected insofar as the Son can,
He's affected by the
who's the
creation.
logos, can God can affect God, and creation takes place in God, in the logos.
And
And
what do
the
we
logos
mean by he's affected by it?
it's certainly not the way the Son
We,
in his
yeah,
humanity is affected by it. Certainly not. All right, because that would be
right.
passive Passionism. But it's not it's not obliviousness, right? It's not insensate. It's not, being completely isolated from it either.
Mhm.
It's he's deep within it without suffering, right? He's still deep within it. He's still very much a part of it, in a sense. He's still very much he's he's affected in a certain way, you would say, without it being, a way that would make Patripassianism orthodox, because it's not. We
Okay.
sort of have to tiptoe around it, but I mean, this is because we're talking now in Trinitarian metaphysics, and this is just way beyond us. So we're just feeling around in the dark. But where, insofar as creation and all of it, it takes place within the logos, and the logos is both affected by and affects the origin, or the Father, right? Then we're part of the matrix on which God affects God. We're in that, and the ultimate destiny of that is where the Son submits everything unified to him, to the Father, that God will be all in all.
Right. Okay. Well, then you end up having to say that this is the only world that could be created, right? In a sense that God has to create this world.
Because I mean, I don't see how that's entailed, because he did, right? He was free to do it, and he did, right? I don't think we have to posit that
Well,
God had to.
what I'm getting at is, because Eden brought it up a little earlier too, was that whenever he talked about Molinism, he says that, well, this whole idea of middle knowledge and would-be situations, it's a very good logical explanation, but it's really tragic in terms of metaphysics, because there can never be a world that is not actualized in God, right? Did you guys catch that in that
Yeah,
chapter?
I totally. Is that a critique? Are you offering a critique of Molinism? Is that what
I'm
you
not
were?
offering a critique of Molinism. I'm just rehearsing what Clark says about Molinism and why his objections and critiques to Molinism.
What's tragic about it, though?
Well, metaphysically, he said that there can never be worlds that are never actualized, because from a Molinist perspective, there are many would-be situations that God decided not to actualize.
Oh.
Right? So
I'm
Clark's
a little
saying, well,
confused. I thought the Molinists believed that all worlds were equally real, and God chooses one, right? Or that's not the
correct.
case.
So that is true. I think how Craig or Plantinga would put it is in terms of, well, there were many different worlds, and God chose this one because this is the most optimal or the maximally effective world, right? So for example, if God's purpose was to save as many as people as possible, this is the world in which that was possible, right? So he chose to create this world rather than the many other worlds that he could have created, but he chose not to because it would not, accomplish his purposes. So, and Clarke's critique of that is that that is not possible. I mean, metaphysically, that's tragic because there can never be worlds that are not actualized.
Yeah.
Okay, so now I'm taking that critique and I'm applying what you're saying about God being affected, because if every world has to be actualized because of actus purus, and then for God to be affected by the second person of the Trinity, like he has to create a world, and that world has to exist.
Well, no, because the Father receives being back from the Son, whether God decided to create or not, whether creation exists within the Logos or not. So God's still affected by the Father is still affected by the Son, right? Secondarily,
but not in the way that he would be affected if there was no creation at all, right?
True.
So
not the same way, differently.
So for him to be affected by the way that he's affected now, post, the incarnation of Christ, he has to create this world.
You seem to be saying that for him to be affected as a creator, he has to create. And I would say trivially, yes, that's true.
Could you
I agree. I do think, and I take Tom Chesky's view on this. Like he or at least he told me personally that he thinks that this implies an amount of determinism, and
yes, that's where I'm getting at. That's exactly where I'm getting at.
I completely agree. I'm just cautious whenever I say it, though. I'm like very hesitant, but I do agree to that extent. Yes, but anyway.
Well, did God really have to be affected by God in the way that he is affected, or could he have been affected by God in another way as not a creator? I think the Orthodox perspective has to affirm that yes, that was a possible counterfactual, but it's not factual.
Well, it's not factual, but it can't even exist if it's not factualized or actualized, right? According to Clarke,
it was logically possible that God could have not created. He did not create under any kind of intrinsic necessity. He wasn't.
Sure. I'm not saying that God intrinsically needs creation. Absolutely not. He is fully himself without creation. Sure.
Yeah.
But what I'm saying is, for him to be affected the same way that he's affected by the incarnation, he has to create this particular world. Right?
He would have to create in order to incarnate, of course.
Right. And so there's a difference between God being affected in a certain way by the second person of the Trinity without creation, and there's a way in which he's affected by creation. And so for that to be actualized, he has to create this world.
Well, he certainly has to create. And I guess that includes making decisions, choices. I mean, sure. Yeah, I would. I mean, I don't know. Molinism is. I sort of go back and forth on it, right? I'm not. I'm
not offending. My point is, though, once you follow that logic, it almost inevitably leads to a deterministic outcome, right?
At least on a transcendental level, I would have to say you're probably right.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and that's kind of that does bother me,
Well, we're not on that level, right? Or our freedom isn't on that level, so it doesn't eliminate our freedom. It guarantees it, actually.
Yeah, well, at that point, you're talking as a Calvinist.
No, not at all. No, because Calvinists would just simply deny the freedom. Period.
What's wrong with the deterministic universe?
A Calvinist would deny that our freedom, that there is a real freedom on any level.
God
Well,
directs my
Calvinist-
steps. That's the greatest news ever.
A Calvinist would. So how would you have a deterministic universe and not have and still have freedom?
Oh,
Well,
well,
there-
if you ask me, the question isn't freedom. The question is responsibility. So I would argue that freedom in this libertarian sense would actually relieve you of responsibility, because in order for you to be responsible for anything, you have to have a deterministic universe that follows the law of causation. Because the law of causation does not
yes.
hold, then
Exactly,
you don't.
and
Yes.
that's exactly what a Calvinist would say.
Yes.
Because a Calvinist would never say that he's a libertarian free will person. He's more of a compatibilistic person who thinks that,
soft determinism, compatibilism, sure, yeah, absolutely. So, well, in other reformers, they would say, it's not a what's the word, divine concordanism, and that is something that originates with Aquinas, actually, that terminology, concordanism. But the Calvinists per se, or the Reform, or whoever, right, the compatibilists would say that debate is not really about libertarianism. The debate is about responsibility, and that the two
Sure.
aren't
correct.
two
correct.
aren't. Yeah. You want to ask how that works?
Well, I don't want to ask how it works. It seems like a Thomist metaphysics would inevitably lead to a Calvinistic understanding of things, which bothers me.
Which is exactly what people like. What's his name? Dolezal.
Yeah. Even
Dolezal,
Hart.
who
Even
else?
Hart.
Carl
Even Hart.
Truman.
Correct. Yes, Dolezal does say that. He does say that. Correct.
And I'm going to show my cards here, but I'm pretty on board with Carl Truman and Richard Howe.
Oh no!
And,
Please don't.
yeah.
Stop.
You have to make the combo interesting.
Stop.
Yes.
No, I don't want to hear.
Yeah, man. So anyway, I know that's this kind of question isn't germane to Norris Clark, but hopefully anything that we just talked about for the last 5 minutes help clarify anything. Anyway,
I guess sort of one question I have about this whole kind of picture about like requiring a deterministic kind of the universe. So I'm going to sort of phrase, I guess, the first part of this as a question is, if we want to say that, in order for there to be, for the incarnation to happen, that there has to be, like God has to create this universe. Isn't it more accurate to say that just God has to create a universe, like a universe in which something like the fall happened, in which something like the sort of like the event, the sort of the narrative of scripture could occur within? Like, surely we don't need to say that down to every last, nut and bolt, so to speak, the world had to be determined in just such the way that it is in order for, the incarnation to happen and for God to, influence God, through the Trinity. I'm not super familiar with that sort of language, so I'm not going to rehearse what Kevin said in any meaningful respect, but I don't see any reason why you require a determinist universe. You just need a universe that exists within certain boundaries, such that the sort of the Christian story in its most important outlines can occur. So I don't think it requires any kind of, Calvinism or determinism or whatever it is that you want to call it. It just requires that certain limitations are placed upon the way that the world can be created. If, for example, like you wouldn't even, at least from an Eastern Orthodox perspective, there wouldn't even have to be sin in the world, because the Orthodox say like, oh, God would have incarnated even if there was no sin, because there would still be the need for the redemption of the material in a sort of Platonic sense, right? So I don't see why there would have to be any kind of hardline determinism. Rather, you would just need certain conditions to be in place, and there are any number of possible worlds within which that kind of that kind of story can occur. So I don't think that there needs to be any kind of hard determinism, just some kind of soft shaping, let's say, by God, in which a great deal of human freedom can can be accounted for. And that's not even going to the idea that there are, transcendent, that again, there's a difference between God's perspective on the world, wherein he's outside of time. So in a sense, everything has already happened, although that's still kind of bad language because God's not viewing it from the end of history, he's viewing it from outside history altogether. So, we can have human freedom while God sort of already observes it as having happened. But even within that, there's no determinism of the universe itself, because like I said, there's quite a few different worlds, I would say, that wherein the Christian story could occur in more or less the same way it did, without requiring everyone to make every choice the exact same way that they did in this world that we're in right now.
I just want to clarify that when I said that the determinism that exists that I think we can't really avoid on the transcendental level guarantees freedom, I didn't say that it guarantees, that we make the particular choices that we do. We are the agent of those choices. We're the guarantor of our choices. God is just the guarantor of our power to do so.
Oh, sorry, I agree 100%. That's what I was trying to say, that in response to the kind of discussion that happened after you made that claim surrounding like Calvinism and deterministic universe, just kind of saying that there's any number of choices that we could have made as, individual agents on Earth that don't really affect a sort of cosmic plan, a kind of cosmic determinism, a transcendental determinism in really any respect whatsoever. They're not incompatible because those choices don't really have anything to do meaningfully with what's actually determined at that level.
If you wanted to be so what people usually accuse determinists of, the determinists of, is fatalism, right? So, and we all know what fatalism is, and that I would say that fatalism does relieve responsibility. But if one wanted to make the objection that a determinist universe, whether it's soft determinism, what have you, a compatibilistic universe per se, relieves responsibility, you would also be implicitly like indirectly implying pantheism, because in order for me not to be responsible for my decisions, okay, yeah, sure, the end and the beginning are already set in stone per se, but you would also have to say that the person performing the action was not that person. It would have to be the first cause performing the action as well. So unless I would myself, this is Truman's point, by the way, I myself
Can you not please reference Truman? You could say his point, but just don't say his name.
Yeah, I hope I was architect. Oh man, if he comes across this video and it turns out I totally botched everything, like I would feel so ashamed. But anyway, if we were ever so to relieve responsibility, you can't just argue for this fatalistic understanding of, there's no maverick molecules, but you also have to argue that the first cause is literally pantheistic, because now the person performing the action is not the person per se. It's literally just the first cause itself. So when I pick up, when I have my drink right here, it's not me doing it. I'm literally God. Like God is literally doing it. And so if pantheism is false, then that means there is a degree for which I am performing the action. I myself am doing it because this will is not the equivocal to or univocal to God. Like it's not God doing it. It's something else than God. Anyway, anyway.
Yeah, it's because like those kind of choices, like picking up a glass of water, or any number of sort of trivial and honestly quite a few non-trivial things. I'd argue that there's again quite a large range of actions that aren't necessarily much the same outline that we understand it in this world could occur. But yeah, those kind of choices aren't really necessary to, from a transcendental perspective, for God to experience it. So to kind of, I guess, get back to what we were talking about, I agree that sort of freedom exists, but I don't really think that has much bearing on the kind of question being asked overall, which is whether or not God can, what kind of universe would need to exist for God to be able to affect himself in such a way that he can be party to the suffering of people on Earth. I hope that's a sufficiently orthodox way to put it. It's very difficult to phrase these kind of questions without coming across as committing any number of anything from thousands to 100-year-old heresies. So, forgive me and know that I'm trying my best with this sort of framing, but I feel like yeah, there's you can have like a sort of, to use the language that's been discussed, a kind of transcendental determinism, in the sense that there are certain things about the universe and about being insofar as it's created that have to be true because God is the way that he is, right? But that doesn't mean that right down to the last drop, everything that exists is therefore determined in the way that it is. Like, I think actually it is. I can't remember if it's In Person and Being or if it's one of Clarke's books. He says, he even goes so far to say, and there might be some disagreement on this from people in here, that even though there isn't necessarily that this particular creation isn't necessary, that God didn't have to create when, so to speak, he did, and God didn't also have to create every single detail of the world the way that he did. But he does say that he thinks that God would have eventually had to have created something, because it's in God's nature in part to be a creator, to be in relation to things. So I think that at least Clarke sees himself as offering a plurality of different creations. And while we have to take into account the idea of there being nothing as a possible counterfactual, it does seem to be out of line kind of with God's being as relational. So insofar as that's the case, I think that you could say, well, in any possible creation that God could have created, would have had to be relational in some sense. And so in that way, God would have eventually had to have created something. We just have no idea what that is, because there's an infinite range of possibilities of what a creation which God is in relationship to could look like.
Well, I can speak to this from as someone who actually took a class with him. So I like having that perspective, because it gives me something of value to contribute. Clarke did say that he believed that God had to create some kind of universe, something. He just wasn't constrained to create this particular one. I don't agree with him that that's orthodox, though. I don't really think that fits with patristic Christianity, or really even St. Thomas. But that was sort of where he hit all that in. He did seem to affirm pretty clearly that creating was something God had to do.
Okay, this conversation is going to take a whole new level as Sam enters the chat.
Didn't we talk about this last time? I feel like the last time we did chapter 16 or something, it went towards this direction.
Yeah, and by the way, Eden, I think in the Lamp of God, Bulgakov takes the same kind of position that you did with the deterministic thing, and he faults the Western tradition for thinking of God as the first cause, and sort of everything is like a domino effect from that point on, and so he rejects that definition to avoid the deterministic implications of some of those things. Welcome, Sam. Happy birthday.
Actually yesterday, but thank you. I'm a
Oh
day
yeah,
ahead of you guys.
you're
Yeah.
ahead. You're literally in the future.
What are you guys talking about? Determinism, it sounds awesome. What's the context of this talking about determinism? Is as far as I can get.
Well, it kind of took a rabbit hole. First, we talked about it started off with the idea that God, being is active. That's a point that Clarke makes in this chapter, that every being affects other beings, and they're affected by other beings. And
except God, of course, who he still calls a being.
Correct. So that was a question I raised. Is God part of that equation? Does that definition apply to God? And we kind of talked about how that is potentially a categorical error, because God is not being, but being itself. So you can't think of God as just another thing in the universe. And then Thomas and Kevin offered a potential solution to that by saying that God is infinitely relational in his eternal being, and that way we can keep both divine simplicity and actus purus and God being relational together. That is what got us into talking about, because then it would imply, because we talked a little bit about how when he talked about Molinism, Father Clark said that the logical or the metaphysical problem with Molinism is that it leaves possible worlds, but there can never be, with God, there can only be an actualized world and not just different possible worlds. And so when we combine that with the eternal relational aspect of God, we question, does that mean that God had to create this particular world
Right.
to be affected by it in the way that
Mhm.
he is? And that is what got us into talking about determinism and so on and so forth. So
I see. Well, thanks for that. So, wait, could you say a little bit more about how that led you to talk about determinism? So I'm just trying to make the connection between
yeah, sure. Kevin
possible worlds and determinism. Yeah, because
Kevin basically said that the Father is affected. Kevin, if I'm misrepresenting your view, please correct. But you basically said that the Father is affected through the Son and the Son's interaction with the world in his incarnation, right? And so for God the Father to be affected by the Son through his relation to creation, through his incarnation, God has made this world to be affected in the way that he is by the Son. Does that make sense?
kind of, yeah. So are you trying to link like the kenosis or the emptiness, self-emptiness of the Son with the Father, to sort of say that the how do I put this? In some sense, there's a kenosis of the Father that's actually in fact revealed through the kenosis of the Son. Is that what you're trying to say?
Kind of the other way around. Trace
Well, I
it
mean,
around, yeah.
so wait, so it would be
So the way that Christ is affected by his incarnation is then affects the Father.
yeah, okay. Interesting. Okay. Yeah. I'm still trying to think about how this metaphysically would obviously chime with apathy or impossibility, but yeah, no, that's interesting to think about. I don't know. I don't know what else to say. Yeah. What else have you talked about? Have you talked about beauty as a transcendental yet, or any of the other transcendentals?
Yeah, we did talk a lot about beauty being one of the transcendentals. What that means. If you have questions about it.
I don't have a question, but a comment. When I was just going through some of the chapter, I noticed that where is it? When he's talking about being as active, which he articulates as his creative retrieval of Thomas, I don't necessarily disagree with that in principle. Like I think I agree that with that, but what I'm not so sure about is the way in which he utilizes, or rather perhaps even misutilizes or misuses Thomas's text in order to get to that conclusion. Because I was looking at one of or both of the quotes of Thomas that he mentioned, from Summa Contra Gentiles, book 3, and I think it was De Potentia question. I don't remember there. It was one of those two verses. So the first one, Summa Contra Gentiles, book 3, 113. he actually misquotes, or at least he doesn't accurately represent what the Latin says. He alters it slightly, which I think is a slightly not dishonest, but he should have at least told when he does this. I'll show you. The Latin is what the Latin literally says, which he quoted. He says, for it seems that everything is on account of its operation. So that's like in Latin, omnes enim res propter suam operationem es, that's what esse videtur. So how he quotes it, though, is I think he adds something to, like, I can't remember the exact quote, but if you look back on the chapter, he adds, he makes it something like, seems that everything presents itself on account of its operation. Like he adds something to do with like the being presenting itself in its being, but that's not in the Latin at all. He just adds that. So that's just, I think, one example of he's trying to, use a bit of Aquinas, perhaps out of context, to support his, creative retrieval. So, yeah. Anyway, that's just one comment I had. Firstly, I mean others, but that's just one. So, what do you guys think about doing that thing today? Do you think that's legitimate or not? And does it make sense of Thomas's broader, like, metaphysics to, even if that's inaccurate, like not quite what Thomas says, do you think that draws out the implications of what he actually believes about the relationship between being and activity, or it's the nature of something and the way it acts, is the way to put it,
He uses a lot of quotes to make that case. I mean, did you find flaws in his other quotes?
Well, there are only 2 quotes he put in this chapter that I noticed. I think earlier in chapter 2, when he makes the case that, is it chapter 2? I think, yeah, early chapter 2, he makes fuller case for the being as active thing, principle, whatever.
Right.
I'll have to look back at those references if there were any, but yeah, I'm just going off what was in the chapter here about, I think he has a right instinct or like intuition, but I'm just not so sure about whether it's completely faithful to Thomas. I mean, that's obviously a separate question, like the question of what's mostly historically faithful to Thomas, and then how can we draw out the implications of Thomas, for our day? There's a kind of the separate but related questions. You can't always.
I can't remember if I looked at all of those. I think I did when I was first learning this. I wanted to look up those texts in Thomas, and I think I did, but I had zero competence with Latin, so I wouldn't have been able to know on that level whether Clark was distorting Thomas to any degree. What I'll say in his defense is, even if he is, he's not the first to do it. Like he's presenting a tradition, a tradition of Thomism, a sort of retrieval of Thomism, and we can call it an interpretation. Maybe even he calls it a creative retrieval. So we can make that we can put that in the creativity column. He's hearkening back to Banyas, because Banyas said that St. Thomas keeps talking about being and act and how it's activity, right? And he's crying out being, and this is what it's all about, and the act of being. And he said the Thomists are having none of it, right? So he's harkening back to this Banyasian metaphysics that was sort of submerged, right? Even when Pope Leo XIII revived Thomism with Aeterni Patris, it wasn't an existential version of Thomism at all. It was just a bunch of, it evolved into just a bunch of pat formula, right? That the like algorithms that you would put any question into, and this is the answer. This is Catholicism, right?
Yep.
And that's a diseased form of theology, philosophy, Thomism, anything, whatever you call it. That's just rubbish. But that's what that was. And so then you have this other stream. And so there might be some liberties being taken. I couldn't really say that I couldn't really guarantee that that wasn't true. I'm curious, and I want to look at the Latin now because I have a little more competence with it, not much, but a little. And I want to see if I can detect some sort of liberties being taken. But even if that's so, I like Samuel, I would appreciate it if we're upfront about, if the writer were upfront about doing that.
Yeah, that's my
But
main
then
concern.
once they're upfront with it, I think it's a good thing to do. Like, say that I'd like to take this in another direction, slightly veer off, because I think here's an idea of value.
Yeah, and in this particular case, I've just looked back at the quote now in the chapter. I think the more immediate or proximate influence is actually phenomenology, 20th century phenomenology, because the quote, the way he slightly paraphrases the quote from Summa Contra Gentiles 3:113, as he says, each and everything shows forth that it exists. This language of showing forth that something exists, manifesting, that is the language of Husserl, Heidegger, phenomenology, right?
Yeah.
And he's clearly influenced by that, and that's fine. I mean, that's the language I like to use myself. But as you say, it would be nice if he said explicitly that he's adding this phenomenological tinge to the quote, rather than making Thomas seem like he was a proto-phenomenologist, which is dubious, isn't it, historically? So, but yeah.
Yeah. Heidegger did study some Aquinas, but it didn't look like he was giving Aquinas much credit for any insights that later came out in Heidegger's work. So, who knows?
Yeah, I think he was more into Duns Scotus though, because he did his thesis or whatever on Duns Scotus, didn't he? Which really shows out in his language of primacy of the will, and his later writings on Gelassenheit, the German word for releasement. It's a very voluntarist kind of note. Well, it's linked to the German mystical tradition of Eckhart, because that's where he gets the word, the notion from. But yeah, he gives it a very Protestant Heidegger, even though he's Catholic, he went to Catholic theological college or something like that. He is very much of a Protestant, not really a Catholic. I make a sharp distinction between a Protestant and a Catholic. I don't a lot of the time, but I just mean historically the influences come, from after the Reformation, Protestants, as opposed to the Catholics and their reaction against Protestants.
That in Culture Comp, he's coming out of that. He's coming out of the wake of Culture Comp, where German Catholicism was being Protestantized.
Perhaps I'm misremembering, but didn't after leaving the seminary Heidegger become a Lutheran, or am I misrecalling something? I was under the impression that by the time of Sein und Zeit he was a Lutheran, like a Protestant proper, not just one whose Catholicism was perhaps influenced by a certain strain of German Protestantism.
Well, and so his wife was Protestant, and so I think effectively he sort of, I don't know whether he was a Lutheran or something else, but essentially, it would be correct to say I think he was a Protestant but maybe of a sort of non-dogmatic sort, kind of in the course of that relationship sort of marked his shift away from Catholicism.
Okay, I for some reason was under the impression that he had a formal conversion, as it were, from Catholicism to Protestantism, but I could be misremembering, or perhaps read an overly zealous Protestant biography of Heidegger. I'm not entirely sure, because the details of his life are not something I want to think about too much when thinking about his philosophy generally. So I don't have the greatest grasp sort of on the whole historical context surrounding Heidegger's philosophy. So if anyone does remember more clearly than I do about the specifics of that, I would love to hear it. But it's not the most important issue, obviously, to discuss right now.
Yeah, no, I'm pretty sure that he never converted to Protestantism officially. After he studied at the Catholic, it was a Jesuit seminary, I think. After that, he studied theology at University of Freiburg, which is a Protestant. Is it Protestant? I think it's Protestant university. But he never converted he was just, that was his environment. That was the environment in which he was in, I think. I think that's the better way to put it. Yeah.
Yeah, I think by the time that he's writing Being in Time et al., right? He is either an atheist or all but an atheist. I mean, whether he had a nominal Lutheran church membership, that's a fact. That's a fact if it's true that I wasn't aware of. But by that time, he doesn't really have much patience for theistic ideas. By that, my impression was that he was pretty much an atheist.
Yeah, I think you're right. Have you guys talked at all about the realism, metaphysical realism of Aquinas and Clarke, like in this chapter? Because that was one thing I wanted to mention. It was in the chapter, the section on being is true or intelligible, where he talks about the where is it? He makes a distinction between us created beings conforming to or being measured by our human minds, and created beings being the other way. What am I trying to say? He's trying to emphasize this kind of receptivity and a set of passivity, that in order to argue for his realism, that we receive or are measured by beings outside us, as opposed to we imposing, actively, as supposedly Kant, did in making the distinction, between the categories and the beings. The empirical, as empirically known prior to the categories, or after the categories. Sorry. I'm not so sure. I'm not persuaded by at all by Thomistic realism metaphysically. Well, I mean, there's some aspects to it I think I'm somewhat sympathetic to. I mean, I agree that I'm not a subjective idealist. I'm a objective idealist, or a Hegelian idealist. So I would want to emphasize that we both actively compose, but also passively receive beams. It's not mainly we receive beams, primarily, and and then secondarily we actively. I don't think that. I think that hierarchical priority is just wrong. Like I think it should be both at the same time. Yeah, if that makes any sense to any of you, but yeah.
Yeah, I was mentioning earlier in another context what Clark was saying in Person and Being, his Marquette University Aquinas lecture, 1993. And he was proposing that receptivity should be upgraded to parity with its complementary principle rather than being something considered inferior or less, where your receptivity would always be considered an inferior thing to what is to the principle imparting. And he puts that he locates that in the Trinity, and he says that if this is true in the Trinity, then we can reevaluate receptivity on all levels of being. So and that, well, even on the personal level, we can see receptivity as a kind of perfection, as a kind of something done actively, and that it's something done to be done right, and it's a perfection of its own. So I see what you were saying, and I connected to that in terms of the value of receptivity and it being it being parallel with its co-principle, rather than something that's secondary or comes after or something like that, or consequential.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think the main cause of this emphasis on like realism, as opposed to, or whatever, the opposite, which Thomas are rejecting, anti-realism, which they usually identify with idealism, or at least some form of that, is because as after Kant, post-Kantian legacy, there's this increasingly sharp division between the subject and the object, between the real and the ideal, etc., which wasn't there at all in previous centuries, or at least, not in such a sharp way.
Usually realism was distinguished from nominalism rather than idealism back then, or at least among when Thomists were fighting about it, that was that was where they were drawing the line, because I think they weren't even going to consider giving quarter to idealism. Like, that would be just fringe. That would be way out there. Like, you weren't supposed to give any quarter to Kant or German idealism on any level. It was like verboten. Like, that was one of the reasons why the blessed Antonio Rismini almost didn't become blessed. Was almost flagged as a heretic because he was too accommodating. To be his form of Thomism was too accommodating to Kant and too accommodating to idealism.
Mhm. Yeah. It's like a little bit more like concrete of what I'm disagreeing with. So like when in that chapter Clark says that beings are intelligible through and through in themselves because they have been created by infinite mind. The sense in which that's right, I guess, but this idea of beings being I don't know how to express this. I mean, firstly, this idea of a being being intelligible in and of itself doesn't make sense to me as an idealist. I don't think that there's such a thing as a being that's intelligible in itself, an abstraction from minds, right? But Clark will just say, the divine mind. If the human mind doesn't know of, a being that's intelligible in itself, then the divine mind can know. But then that just raises the question of like, how does why do we even need to say that the divine mind knows things in themselves? You need this abstraction, or is it just superfluous? It kind of seems to be a projection of us, really. Our abstraction.
Can I just make a quick, so I'm going to stop the video. Samuel, can you record the rest of the conversation?
If you want me to, I'll try.
Please. Awesome.
Okay.
Yeah. It just seems like it's getting good, and I just have to be mobile while still.
Okay.